Hello friends, in this lecture we're going to implement the enemy taking damage. Okay, so at the moment when we attack the enemy we're printing its name. Now we're going to implement the take damage function so that we can actually hurt the enemy. Let's switch over to the header file of the enemy and declare the function at the bottom. This is going to be void take damage. It's going to accept the damage amount as an integer. It's also going to accept the stun duration as a float. The stun duration is going to control how long the enemy gets stunned after being attacked, and the damage amount is going to control how much we're going to deduct from the hit points. Let's go ahead and create the function body at the bottom here. And now that we have the function, we can go back into the player and make this call, and we can stop printing the name. We need to pass the damage amount and the stun duration, and those are going to be variables inside of the player. First one is going to be attack damage, and the second one is going to be attack stun duration. Just like that. Let's go ahead and create these inside of the player's header. I'm going to scroll down. We're going to get one of these edit anywheres. I'll also make this blueprint read write. Why not? The first one is going to be integer attack damage. Let's make this 25. So each hit of the player is going to hit the enemy for 25 damage. And the second one is going to be a float called stun attack stun duration. And we're going to make this 0.3 seconds. So when the enemy is attacked, it's going to get stunned for 0.3 seconds. We made these edit anywhere so we can easily change these inside of the editor if we don't like them. Okay, so now we're actually making the call to take damage here in attack box overlap begin. Let's also go ahead and implement this function. First of all, before we do anything in here, we need to check if the enemy is currently alive. Because if the enemy is not alive, we're just going to return. Because there's no point trying to take damage if the enemy is already dead. But if the enemy is alive, we're going to go ahead and update the hit points with hit points minus damage amount. So we're going to subtract the damage amount we received from the current hit points of the enemy, and then we're going to update it using that. So this is also going to update the text render component. After we do this, we need to check if the enemy is still alive or dead, because it just took damage. So to check that, we're going to write an if statement. And as a small challenge, see if you can write the if statement that checks if the enemy is still alive or dead. Okay, so the if statement is going to be if hit points less than or equal to 0, else. If it is less than or equal to 0, that means the enemy is dead. If it is greater than 0, that means enemy is still alive. Just like that. If you wrote the opposite if statement, if you checked if it is greater than 0 in here, that's also fine. These are just going to be reversed. So you can just keep it that way if you want to, or you can change it. So after we apply the damage, if the enemy is dead, first of all, we're going to say update hit points 0. And we also don't need to do a float here because this is an integer. We need to do this because let's say that the enemy had 5 hit points and we hit the enemy for 10. That's going to make the hit points go negative. But we don't want to have negative hit points. So if the hit points are less than 0, we're just going to set it to be 0. And after we do that, we're going to say HP text set hidden in game true. Because once the enemy is dead, there's no point displaying the hit points on the screen anymore, because the enemy is going to use the dead animation anyways, so it's going to be apparent that it's dead. We don't need to display 0 on the screen. After this, we're going to set is alive to false, and also can move to false, so that the enemy stops moving. And we're also setting is alive to false so that we don't, try to do this function again. or anything that has to do with is alive. And after we do this, we want to play the die animation. But we're not going to be able to do that in this lecture. That's going to be the topic of the next lecture. So this if statement is currently complete. And in the else statement, the enemy is still alive. That means the enemy just took a hit. So we want to play the take hit animation. But besides that, currently, we're not going to do anything else. So now this should work. We don't really need to print any messages in here because we're going to update the text render component. So that's going to tell us if this is working or not. We're making the call in the player when we attack. So now we can actually go ahead and exit out of Unreal, rebuild the project, and then test if this works or not. So let's go ahead and test the game. Now we should be able to attack the enemy, and the enemy's hit points will go down, as you can see from the text render component. The enemy is still alive, so it's going to keep following me. But if I go ahead and kill it, it's going to stop. I can't hit the enemy anymore, and the text render component became invisible. So everything seems to be working fine. The next step here is going to be playing the die animation and the take hit animation when we attack the enemy. We're going to do that in the next lecture using jump nodes. In this one, before we end, I want to stop printing begin and end each time we attack. So I'm going to go inside of the anim notify state here and get rid of these print statements. Just like that. Now we're going to do a final recap before we end the lecture. So in this lecture, we implemented the take damage function, which is going to subtract the damage amount we receive from the hit points of the enemy, and then it's going to check if the enemy is alive or dead. If it is dead, it's going to set the hit points to 0, just in case it went below 0. It's going to hide the text render component, and it's going to set these booleans to false so that the enemy stops moving. That is the take damage function, and we're calling it from the player right here when we attack the enemy.